The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber hissed open with mechanical precision, releasing a cloud of filtered atmosphere that shimmered like liquid starlight. Marcus Chen stepped through the threshold, his heavy boots echoing against the crystal floor with each measured step. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the vast space, drawing unwanted attention to his approach. Above him, the dome stretched impossibly high, its transparent walls revealing the swirling nebula of Andros Prime beyond. Thousands of seats carved from luminescent stone rose in perfect tiers, each occupied by representatives from across the known galaxy. Their eyes, some compound, others multifaceted, many completely alien to human understanding, turned toward him with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed disdain. Marcus kept his gaze forward, focusing on the central platform where the Council of Five sat in judgment. His uniform, crisp and bearing the insignia of the Terran Federation, felt uncomfortably tight across his scarred shoulders. The medical team had done their best to heal the damage from the Kepler station incident, but some wounds ran too deep for even advanced alien medicine to completely erase. The first whisper came from somewhere in the upper tiers, carried by the chamber's perfect acoustics to every corner of the room. It was spoken in Vexillian, a language Marcus had learned during his years of service, and the translation made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Look at the scarring on that one. How primitive their healing methods must be." A chorus of similar comments followed, each speaker apparently unaware that the human understood their words. The Zephyrians clicked their mandibles in what passed for laughter among their species. The crystalline collective hummed a frequency that Marcus recognized as mockery. Even the normally reserved ethereal commune allowed their translucent forms to shimmer with what could only be amusement. Marcus had faced charging Vorthan battle beasts on the mining colonies of Epsilon Ceti. He had held the line against raider fleets in the asteroid fields of the Outer Rim. He had watched good soldiers die in his arms while enemy fire painted the void around them in brilliant, deadly colors. But, standing here, surrounded by beings who saw his scars as marks of weakness rather than badges of survival, required a different kind of courage. Ambassador Thexhai of the Vexillian Empire leaned forward in his ornate chair, his four eyes glinting with predatory interest. His translator collar flickered to life, converting his hissing speech into perfect galactic standard. "The humans send us a damaged warrior to represent their interests." How telling. The comment drew more laughter from the assembled delegates. Marcus noticed how the sound varied between species, some chirped, others buzzed, and a few produced sounds that had no earthly equivalent. But the meaning was universal, they found him inadequate. Chancellor Vorthanan of the Council of Five raised one of her 6 arms for silence. Her species, the Hedonian Order, valued protocol above all else, and the chamber gradually quieted at her gesture. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of millennia of diplomatic tradition. "The Terran Federation has requested representation in these proceedings regarding the territorial dispute in the Kepler system. We acknowledge the presence of their representative, Marcus Chen of the Terran Marine Corps." She paused, her compound eyes studying him with clinical detachment. "Though we note with interest their choice to send a warrior bearing such extensive battle damage to our sacred chamber." Marcus stepped forward to the designated speaking area, a circle of polished metal that reflected the chamber's lights like a mirror. The distance between him and the nearest delegate felt immense, as if he stood alone on an island surrounded by an ocean of skeptical faces. "Honored delegates," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic enhancement. "I come before you not as a damaged warrior, but as a representative of humanity's commitment to peaceful resolution of disputes. These scars you observe tell a story not of weakness, but of sacrifice made in defense of innocent lives." Advisor Kethmos of the crystalline collective's form pulsed with what Marcus had learned to recognize as derision. "Sacrifice? Your species glorifies violence to such a degree that you wear its marks as decoration. How can we trust the words of one whose body speaks only of conflict?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus felt the weight of representation pressing down on him. Every human in the galaxy was being judged based on this moment, this conversation. The future of his species' place in the galactic community might well depend on how he handled the next few minutes. "You speak of my scars as if they were chosen decorations," Marcus replied, his tone remaining level despite the provocation. "Let me tell you how they were earned. The mark across my left shoulder that came from shielding a Vexillian child during the pirate raid on Ceres Station. The burns on my forearms happened when I pulled 3 crystalline workers from a collapsing mine shaft on Altair 7. Each mark on my body represents a moment when I chose to protect others rather than preserve my own unmarked flesh.
The chamber grew quieter, though Marcus could still sense the undercurrent of skepticism.
Delegate Prindara of the ethereal commune floated closer to the speaking circle, her gossamer form shimmering with curiosity. You claim these wounds were earned in service to other species, yet you arrive here to argue for human expansion into contested space. Your actions seem to contradict your words, warrior. Marcus turned to face her directly, noting how the light from the nebula beyond seemed to pass through her semi-transparent body. The Kepler system contains 17 habitable worlds, 3 of which are already home to established colonies. The Terran Federation seeks only the right to maintain our existing settlements on Kepler 7, which we established through legitimate purchase agreements with the local Nexary government. We ask for nothing more than the right to continue protecting the 2 million beings who call that world home. 2 million beings of various species, added Ambassador Thexhai with obvious skepticism. Including, we note, a significant population of refugees from species that your own military actions have displaced. The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth.
The border wars had indeed created refugee populations, though the causes were far more complex than the Vexillion was suggesting.
Marcus had seen those refugee camps firsthand, had worked to establish safe zones and evacuation protocols that saved countless lives. The displacement you reference occurred during legitimate defense of sovereign Terran territory, Marcus replied carefully.
However, rather than simply turning away those affected by the conflict, humanity chose to offer sanctuary.
Kepler 7 has become home to beings from 17 different species, all living in peace under Terran protection. Counselor Yethrun of the Silicon Confederacy spoke for the first time, his crystalline voice ringing like struck metal.
Protection that comes at the point of human weapons.
Your species' definition of peace seems to require the constant threat of violence. Marcus felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same fire that had sustained him through countless battles. But, here, in this chamber of words rather than weapons, such emotions were more liability than asset. He forced himself to breathe deeply, to remember the faces of those he had fought to protect. You see weapons where I see tools, he said finally. A farmer's plow can be beaten into a sword, but that does not make every farmer a warrior. Humanity carries weapons because we have learned, through bitter experience, that the universe contains those who would harm the innocent. We do not seek conflict, but neither do we flee from it when it comes to our door. The back-and-forth continued for another hour, with delegates posing increasingly pointed questions about human military doctrine, territorial ambitions, and what they saw as humanity's troubling tendency toward violent solutions. Marcus answered each query with patience and precision, drawing on years of diplomatic training and his own extensive experience in interspecies cooperation. But he could feel the mood of the chamber. Despite his words, despite his careful explanations and documented evidence of humanity's peaceful intentions, the delegates remained unconvinced. They saw his scars and assumed they knew his story. They looked at his species' military record and drew conclusions that no amount of diplomatic language seemed able to shake. As the formal questioning period drew to a close, Chancellor Vorthanen consulted with her fellow council members in rapid, whispered conference. When she turned back to the chamber, her expression was unreadable behind her compound eyes.
The council will recess for deliberation, she announced.
All delegates will remain available for further questioning as needed.
This session is adjourned until tomorrow at the 7th hour.
The chamber began to empty with surprising speed, delegates floating, walking, or gliding toward the exits according to their species' preferred method of locomotion. Marcus remained in the speaking circle, watching them leave and noting the clusters of conversation that formed in their wake. He could see deals being made, alliances being formed or strengthened, all without his participation. As the last of the major delegates filed out, Marcus finally allowed his shoulders to relax slightly. The first day had gone about as well as he could have expected, which was to say it had been a disaster. His scars had become the focus of discussion rather than his words. His species' military record overshadowed any evidence of their peaceful intentions. But, as he turned to leave the speaking circle, a small figure approached from one of the lower tiers. The being was barely 3 feet tall, covered in soft gray fur, with large dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of ancient wisdom.
Marcus recognized the species, Quillen, from the Outer Rim territories. Representative Chen, the small being said in accented but clear galactic standard. I am Keeper Myril Sean of the Quillen Archive. Might I have a word?
Marcus nodded, grateful for any friendly contact after the hostility of the main session.
Of course, Keeper. How can I help you?
The Quillen gestured toward a quieter alcove near one of the chamber's side exits. As they walked together, Marcus noticed how the small being moved with surprising grace despite their diminutive stature. "I observed your testimony today with great interest," Narration said once they had reached relative privacy. "The Council sees your scars as evidence of primitive healing and violent tendencies. But I have studied the archives of many species, and I recognize something different in those marks." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. "What do you see, Keeper?" The Quillen's dark eyes seemed to study every line and mark on Marcus's visible skin. "I see the medical signature of emergency battlefield treatment. These were not wounds that healed poorly due to primitive medicine, they were wounds that should have been fatal, treated under impossible conditions with whatever resources were available. You carry the marks of someone who refused to abandon their post even when survival itself was in doubt." The observation was so accurate that Marcus felt a moment of surprise. The most visible scar across his jaw was indeed from the siege of Outpost Delta, where he had maintained communications with the evacuation fleet even after raider artillery had brought half the command bunker down on top of him. "The Quillen have a saying," Narration continued. "The tree that bends in the storm lives to see calm skies, but the tree that stands firm saves the saplings in its shadow. I believe, Representative Chen, that tomorrow's proceedings will test whether the Council can see the difference between trees that bend and trees that stand firm." Before Marcus could ask what the Keeper meant by that cryptic comment, Narration bowed politely and walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that the real test of his mission was yet to come. The diplomatic quarters assigned to Marcus were modest by galactic standards, a simple room with basic amenities and a viewport that looked out onto the swirling colors of the Andrus Nebula. He had spent the night reviewing case files, strategic reports, and diplomatic protocols, preparing for what he hoped would be a more productive second day of negotiations. The morning brought unexpected news. When Marcus arrived at the council chamber, he found the seating arrangement had changed dramatically. Instead of the usual scattered placement that allowed for informal discussion between species, the delegates were now arranged in distinct faction blocks. The tension in the air was palpable, crackling like the moment before a thunderstorm. Chancellor Vorthanan called the session to order with unusual promptness, her 6 arms moving in ritual gestures that Marcus recognized from his diplomatic briefings. But there was something different in her bearing today, a formality that seemed to carry weight beyond mere protocol. "The Council has deliberated through the night regarding the Terran petition for recognition of their Kepler-7 colony," she announced, her compound eyes reflecting the chamber's lights. "However, new information has come to our attention that requires immediate consideration." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. New information could mean anything from intelligence reports to diplomatic pressure from major powers. In his experience, surprises in negotiations were rarely good news for the smaller party. Ambassador Thexai rose from his seat, his 4 eyes gleaming with something that looked uncomfortably like anticipation. "The Vexillian Empire wishes to present evidence that casts doubt on the Terran Federation's fitness for continued membership in this council." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. This was no longer about the Kepler system, they were challenging humanity's entire place in the galactic community. He forced himself to remain outwardly calm while his mind raced through possibilities and protocols. "The Council will hear this evidence," Chancellor Vorthanen declared, though Marcus caught a note of reluctance in her voice. Politics, he realized. The Chancellor might not want this confrontation, but she was bound by procedure to allow it. Thexai activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber with 3-dimensional images. The first showed a battle scene, ships engaged in violent combat against a backdrop of stars and debris. Marcus recognized it immediately, the Battle of Rigel Station, where a combined human Nexari fleet had driven off a massive pirate armada. "The Terran Federation claims to be a peaceful species seeking only to protect innocent lives," Thexai began, his translator collar turning his hissing speech into precise galactic standard. "Yet their military record tells a different story. In the past decade alone, they have been involved in over 300 armed conflicts." The number was technically accurate, but stripped of all context. Marcus knew that each of those conflicts had been defensive in nature, responses to pirate raids, territorial violations, or direct attacks on human settlements. But he also knew how statistics could be manipulated to support any narrative. The holographic display shifted to show casualty reports, damage assessments, and footage from various conflicts. Thexai had done his homework, every piece of evidence was real, factual, and carefully selected to paint humanity in the worst possible light. Most telling of all, the Vexillian continued, is their choice of representative. They send us not a diplomat or a scholar, but a warrior whose very body bears the marks of countless conflicts. Look at him, honored delegates.
Every scar tells the story of violence embraced rather than avoided.
The chamber erupted in discussion as delegates turned to examine Marcus more closely. He could feel their eyes on him like physical weight, cataloging every visible mark and drawing their own conclusions about what those marks meant. Councillor Yethrun of the Silicon Confederacy added his crystalline voice to the accusations. The Terran representative's own service record supports these concerns. 12 major engagements, 47 minor actions, decorated for valor in close combat situations.
This is not the record of a peacekeeper, it is the resume of a professional killer.
Marcus felt the careful control he had maintained since arriving beginning to crack. These beings were taking his service record, his years of sacrifice and dedication to protecting others, and twisting it into evidence of bloodthirsty aggression. The injustice of it burned in his chest like acid. But, before he could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the chamber's noise. Delegate Prindara of the ethereal commune floated forward, her gossamer form shimmering with what Marcus had learned to recognize as deep thought. If we are to judge the Terran representative by his scars, she said, her voice carrying the haunting quality of wind through crystal chimes, should we not hear how they were earned? To condemn based on appearance alone seems unworthy of this council.
Chancellor Vorthanan nodded slowly. The ethereal delegate raises a valid point. Representative Chen, you will be given the opportunity to address these accusations directly.
Marcus stepped forward into the speaking circle, feeling the weight of every eye in the chamber upon him. This was the moment Keeper Myril Shan had warned him about, the real test that would determine not just the fate of Kepler-7, but humanity's place in the galactic community. Honored delegates, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the acoustic enhancement. Ambassador Thexai has presented you with facts, but facts without context are merely numbers.
Allow me to provide that context.
He gestured toward the holographic display, which still showed images from various human conflicts. The Battle of Rigel Station, which you see depicted here.
The Vexillian Empire's presentation doesn't mention that this battle was fought to protect a medical convoy carrying refugees from the Plague Worlds.
The aggression you see was humanity placing itself between pirates and 300,000 innocent beings seeking medical treatment.
The chamber grew quieter, though Marcus could still sense skepticism from many quarters.
He continued, focusing on the council members who seemed most willing to listen.
The Siege of Outpost Delta, another conflict in Ambassador Thexai's presentation.
What the statistics don't show is that this was a communications relay station that served 17 different colonies. When raiders attacked, we could have evacuated and left the station to be destroyed. Instead, we held our position for 6 days against overwhelming odds to keep those communication lines open. The scar across my jaw came from that battle, earned while I maintained contact with evacuation fleets that saved over 2 million beings. Marcus touched the mark briefly, remembering the taste of blood and dust, the sound of incoming artillery that seemed to never stop. Every engagement in our military record followed the same pattern, humanity standing between threat and innocent life, absorbing damage so others could reach safety. Advisor Kethmos of the Crystalline Collective pulsed with what Marcus hoped was curiosity rather than skepticism. You speak of protection and sacrifice, yet your species maintains one of the largest military forces in known space. How do you reconcile this apparent contradiction? The question was fair, and Marcus had expected it. Because we learned the cost of being unprepared. 50 years ago, humanity was a single-planet species with no military to speak of. When the hegemony wars reached our system, we had no choice but to evacuate Earth completely. We spent 3 years as refugees, dependent on the charity of others while our homeworld burned. He paused, letting that image sink in. Every species in the galaxy knew the story of Earth's evacuation. It was one of the largest humanitarian disasters in recorded history. When we finally returned to rebuild, we made a promise: never again would humanity be helpless in the face of aggression. But we also made another promise, that our strength would be used to ensure others never faced the same helplessness we had experienced. The holographic display flickered as Marcus activated his own presentation system, authorized by diplomatic protocols. New images filled the chamber: refugee camps, evacuation fleets, medical stations bearing the Terran Federation flag. This is the other side of human military action. For every battle we've fought, we've also conducted 17 humanitarian missions. For every enemy ship we've destroyed, we've rescued 37 vessels in distress. These scars you see as marks of aggression? They're proof that when faced with the choice between our own safety and the protection of others, humanity chooses to stand and fight.
Ambassador Thexhi's 4 eyes glinted with anger at having his presentation challenged.
Pretty words, human, but words are easily spoken. Your actions on the frontier tell a different story, territorial expansion masked as humanitarian concern. Marcus felt his temper flare but forced himself to remain calm.
What territorial expansion?
The Kepler-7 colony was established through legitimate purchase agreements with the local Nexary government. We bought that land, fair and square, following all galactic commerce regulations. The only expansion we've done is building schools, hospitals, and farms to support the refugee populations that asked for our help.
Refugees you created through your own military actions, Thexhi shot back. The accusation hung in the air like a poison cloud.
Marcus knew this was the real heart of the matter, the border wars that had started when human colonies were attacked by hegemony remnants. The wars had been necessary, but they had also displaced civilian populations who found themselves caught between opposing forces. The border wars were a defensive response to direct attacks on human civilian populations, Marcus replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. When the hegemony remnants began targeting our agricultural worlds, killing farmers and burning crops, we had a choice: submit to gradual extermination or fight back. We chose to fight. And, when that fighting displaced innocent civilians on both sides, we chose to accept responsibility for their welfare rather than leave them to starve. Delegate Prindara floated closer to the speaking circle, her ethereal form shimmering with what seemed like deep consideration. The question before us is not whether the Terran representative has fought battles, but whether those battles were just. War is sometimes necessary, even among peaceful species. Her words seemed to resonate with some of the smaller delegations. Marcus noticed representatives from species that had faced their own existential threats nodding slightly. But the major powers remained unmoved.
Chancellor Vorthanan raised one of her arms for attention.
The Council recognizes that this testimony raises complex questions about the nature of justified conflict and species responsibility. However, we cannot ignore the broader pattern of human military engagement. She activated another holographic display, this one showing a galactic map with markers indicating every location where human military forces had been deployed. The sheer number of markers was overwhelming, creating a visual impression of aggressive expansion even though Marcus knew each one represented a defensive action or humanitarian mission. The frequency of human military deployment is unprecedented among Council species, Vorthanen continued. This raises legitimate questions about whether humanity can be trusted with the responsibilities that come with Council membership.
Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet.
They were building toward something, a formal challenge or vote that would strip humanity of its representation. His mission to secure recognition for Kepler-7 was becoming a desperate fight to maintain humanity's basic rights in the galactic community. The pattern you observe is not one of aggression, Marcus said, putting everything he had into his voice. It's the pattern of a species that refuses to stand by while others suffer. Yes, we fight more often than other Council members.
We fight because someone has to.
We fight because when the call for help comes, we answer.
Councillor Yethron's crystalline form rang with what sounded like dismissal.
Noble words, but perhaps it is time for humanity to step back and allow other species to bear these burdens. Your own service record proves the cost of such involvement. Look what it has done to you personally. The attack was more personal than Marcus had expected. He could feel the delegates studying his scars again, but this time with a different perspective.
Instead of seeing marks of violence, some were beginning to see evidence of sacrifice.
The shift was subtle, but Marcus sensed it nonetheless. You ask what the cost has been to me personally, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a quieter register that somehow carried more weight than his previous declarations. I have lost friends who were closer than brothers. I have made choices that will haunt me until I die. I carry pain in my body that will never fully heal, and memories that will never fade. The chamber had grown completely silent, the weight of personal truth cutting through political maneuvering. But I have also had the privilege of standing between hope and despair, between light and darkness. I have looked into the eyes of children who would have died without human intervention, and I have seen gratitude from beings whose species I had never encountered before that moment. If the cost of that privilege is carrying these scars, then I consider myself fortunate to bear them. The silence stretched for long moments before Chancellor Vorthanan spoke again.
The Council will recess for 1 hour to consider this testimony. When we reconvene, we will hear final arguments before proceeding to formal deliberation.
As the delegates began to file out for the recess, Marcus remained in the speaking circle, emotionally drained by the intensity of the exchange. He had laid everything bare: his personal history, his species' motivations, and humanity's vision of its place in the galaxy. Now all he could do was wait and see whether it had been enough. The recess hour passed with agonizing slowness. Marcus found himself alone in a small observation lounge adjacent to the main chamber, watching automated cargo vessels navigate through the nebula beyond the transparent walls. Their movements were precise and predictable, following shipping lanes that had been established centuries before humanity had even achieved spaceflight. Everything in the galactic community seemed to follow ancient patterns, established protocols that left little room for the kind of improvisation that had become humanity's signature approach to survival. When the session reconvened, Marcus immediately sensed a change in the chamber's atmosphere. The delegates had clearly spent their recess time in serious discussion, and new alliance patterns seemed to have emerged. The smaller delegations had clustered together in a way that suggested coordination, while the major powers maintained their rigid factional arrangements. Chancellor Vorthanen called the session to order with ceremonial precision, but Marcus caught something new in her compound eyes. What he hoped was respect, though it was difficult to read emotion in features so alien to human experience. The Council has received a formal petition during the recess period, she announced, her voice carrying unusual gravity. The Coalition of Frontier Systems has requested the right to present additional testimony regarding Terran Federation military operations in their territories. Marcus felt his blood run cold. The Coalition represented over 40 smaller species and political entities, most of which had been affected in some way by the various conflicts humanity had been involved in. If they had coordinated against him during the recess, his mission was finished before the formal vote even began. A figure rose from the Coalition seating area, tall, crystalline, with the flowing movements that marked her as a member of the Resonance Collective. Marcus had studied the species during his diplomatic preparation, but had never encountered one in person. They were known for their absolute commitment to truth, regardless of political consequences. "I am Harmony Singer Velthara," the figure announced, her voice carrying overtones that seemed to vibrate in Marcus's bones. "I speak for those worlds that have experienced Terran military presence firsthand." Marcus steeled himself for another litany of accusations, another recitation of human conflicts stripped of context and presented as evidence of aggressive expansion. But what came next caught him completely off guard. The delegates of this council have heard much about human warfare, but they have not heard from those who were present when that warfare saved our lives. Velthara's crystalline form shifted, light refracting through her body to create patterns that Marcus somehow understood conveyed deep emotion. 3 years ago, raiders struck the harmonious worlds. Our people have no military tradition, we resolve all conflicts through negotiation and consensus. When armed vessels began destroying our orbital cities, we had no response except to transmit desperate pleas for assistance. The chamber had grown deadly quiet. Marcus remembered the Harmonious Worlds incident, though he had not been personally involved. It had been a textbook humanitarian intervention, overwhelming force applied with surgical precision to neutralize the threat while minimizing civilian casualties. 17 different species received our distress call. 16 offered sympathetic words and promises to bring the matter before their respective governments for consideration. The humans sent a battle fleet. Velthara's voice took on harmonics that seemed to convey gratitude in ways that mere words could not. They arrived within 48 hours and eliminated the threat in 6 hours of combat. Not one civilian life was lost to human weapons fire. Ambassador Thexhai shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his four eyes darting between Velthara and the other coalition delegates. This was clearly not the testimony he had expected from the frontier species. But the truly remarkable aspect of human intervention was what happened afterward, Velthara continued. They did not claim salvage rights to the destroyed raider vessels. They did not demand territorial concessions or trade agreements. They offered medical assistance to the wounded and engineering support to rebuild our damaged stations. When we asked what payment they required for this aid, they said the safety of our children was payment enough. Another figure rose from the coalition seating area, this one shorter and covered in iridescent fur that sparkled in the chamber's lights. Marcus recognized the species as Fenari, from the Outer Rim trading posts. "I am Trademaster Kith Ran of the Fenari Commercial Guild," the new speaker announced. "The Vexillian Empire suggests that human military presence represents a threat to galactic stability. I wish to present alternative testimony." The trademaster activated a personal holographic display that showed shipping manifests and trade route maps. Before human involvement in frontier security, my people lost an average of 12% of our cargo vessels to piracy each year.
The cost of protection escorts made trade with many worlds economically unfeasible. The display shifted to show more recent statistics, and the contrast was dramatic.
In the 3 years since the Terran Federation began providing security patrols along major trade routes, cargo losses have dropped to less than 2%. The humans charge nothing for this service. They ask only for recognition of their legitimate territorial claims and the right to establish supply bases for their patrol vessels. Marcus watched Ambassador Thexhi's expression grow increasingly sour as delegation after delegation from the frontier worlds rose to offer similar testimony. The pattern was consistent: human intervention had been requested by those under threat, had been swift and effective, and had come with remarkably few strings attached. But Marcus also understood the political dynamics at play. The major powers of the galaxy had not built their influence by allowing smaller species to act independently. Every human intervention that succeeded without their oversight was a challenge to the established order, regardless of how humanitarian the motivations might be. Council Keeper Dax Thor of the Silicon Confederacy finally rose to respond to the coalition testimony. His crystalline form resonated with harmonic frequencies that Marcus's translator interpreted as carefully controlled anger. The Council appreciates these testimonials regarding Terran military efficiency, he said, his voice ringing like struck metal.
However, efficiency in warfare is not the same as wisdom in governance.
The humans may be effective protectors, but protection can become domination if unchecked by proper oversight. The argument was sophisticated and dangerous. Dax Thor was not challenging human intentions or competence, but rather arguing that such competence needed to be controlled by established galactic institutions. It was the classic imperial argument: we must rule for your own good. Velthara's crystalline form shifted again, light patterns conveying what Marcus interpreted as polite disagreement. With respect, Council Keeper, the Harmonious Worlds formally requested oversight from 3 major powers during our crisis. All 3 declined to intervene, citing the complexity of frontier politics. Only when our cities were burning did anyone care to act, and that someone was humanity. Which brings us to the central question, Chancellor Vorthanen interjected, her 6 arms moving in gestures that demanded attention. The testimony we have heard today raises fundamental questions about the nature of galactic security and the role of military force in humanitarian crises. However, we cannot ignore the broader implications of allowing any single species to act as unilateral protector of frontier worlds. Marcus felt the debate reaching a crucial turning point. The coalition testimony had neutralized the worst accusations against humanity, but it had also exposed the real reason for this challenge. The major powers were not afraid of human aggression, they were afraid of human independence. The Terran Federation acknowledges the complexity of these issues, Marcus said, stepping forward into the speaking circle. We have never claimed the right to act as universal protector. We respond to direct requests for assistance from legitimate governments under threat. We do not intervene in internal disputes or territorial conflicts between established powers. Yet your very willingness to intervene changes the balance of power, Dax Thor replied, his crystal form resonating with harmonic emphasis. Frontier species begin to look to humanity for protection rather than seeking proper channels through established galactic institutions. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus realized this was the moment he had been building toward since his arrival, the fundamental question of whether humanity would be allowed to act according to its own moral compass or would be forced to submit to the bureaucratic caution of the major powers. The proper channels failed, Marcus said simply. In every case where humanity has intervened militarily, established galactic institutions had already been contacted for assistance. They chose not to act. We chose differently. Without consultation, without coordination, without regard for broader consequences, Ambassador Thexhi added, his 4 eyes glinting with something that looked like satisfaction. He thought he was winning this argument. Marcus drew upon years of diplomatic training and combat experience to remain calm, but inside he felt the familiar fire building, the same emotion that had sustained him through countless battles when surrender would have been easier than fighting. The broader consequence of our actions has been the preservation of innocent life, he replied, his voice carrying an edge of steel that made several delegates shift uncomfortably. If that creates political complications for established powers, then perhaps those powers should examine why they were unwilling to act when action was needed. The chamber erupted in discussion as delegates realized Marcus had just directly challenged the moral authority of the galactic establishment. It was a dangerous move, but Marcus sensed it was the only honest response available to him. Chancellor Vorthanen restored order with visible effort, her compound eyes reflecting what might have been approval or concern. The debate has reached a point where formal procedure requires specific resolution. The Council will now hear formal motions regarding Terran Federation membership status and territorial claims. Marcus felt his heart rate spike as the political maneuvering entered its final phase. Everything that had been building toward this moment, the accusations, the testimony, the philosophical debate about the role of force in protecting the innocent, would now be reduced to specific votes that would determine humanity's place in the galactic community. Ambassador Thexai rose with obvious satisfaction, his movements conveying the confidence of someone who believed victory was at hand. The Vexillian Empire formally moves that Terran Federation membership in this council be suspended pending a comprehensive review of their military activities and territorial claims. Furthermore, we move that all human settlements in disputed territories be placed under joint galactic administration until such review is completed. The motion struck Marcus like a physical blow. If passed, it would not only strip humanity of its voice in galactic affairs but also place 2 million beings on Kepler-7 under foreign control. It was everything he had been sent to prevent, wrapped in language that made it sound like reasonable administrative procedure. The crystalline collective seconds the Vexillian motion, Advisor Kethmos announced, his form pulsing with what Marcus had learned to recognize as grim satisfaction. Human military activity has created instability that requires formal oversight to resolve. Marcus realized with growing horror that the major powers had coordinated their response during the recess. They were not simply challenging humanity's territorial claims, they were moving to exclude humans from the galactic community entirely unless they submitted to external control over their military and foreign policy decisions. But, before despair could overwhelm him, an unexpected voice rang out across the chamber. Trademaster Kithran of the Fenari Commercial Guild stood with his iridescent fur bristling in what Marcus recognized as a challenge display. The Coalition of Frontier Systems formally requests the right to present a counter-motion, Kithran announced, his voice carrying an authority that Marcus had not heard in his earlier testimony. We move that rather than restricting Terran Federation activities, this council should formalize humanity's role as emergency response coordinator for frontier security operations. The motion was so unexpected that even Marcus was caught off guard. Instead of defending against accusations of excessive militarism, the coalition was proposing to institutionalize human military intervention under galactic sanction. Such a motion requires detailed consideration and cannot be presented without proper preparation, Chancellor Vorthanen replied, though Marcus caught a note in her voice that suggested she was not entirely displeased by this development. The coalition has been preparing this proposal for 3 standard years, Harmony Singer Velthara announced, her crystalline form radiating patterns of light that seemed to convey absolute confidence. We have detailed operational protocols, resource allocation plans, and command structure recommendations. The frontier species formally request that humanity be granted special humanitarian intervention authority under council oversight. The tables had turned so quickly that Marcus felt dizzy trying to follow the political implications. The major powers had moved to marginalize humanity entirely, but the frontier species were proposing to give humans official status as galactic peacekeepers. The final vote would determine not just the fate of Kepler-7, but the entire future of human participation in galactic civilization. The competing motions hung in the air like opposing stormfronts, creating a tension so thick that Marcus could almost feel it pressing against his skin. Around the chamber, delegates huddled in rapid consultation as the true scope of the political battle became clear. This was no longer about Kepler-7 or even human territorial claims, it had become a fundamental challenge to the established galactic order. Chancellor Vorthanen consulted with her fellow council members in whispered conference, their 6-arm gestures creating a complex dance of bureaucratic procedure. When she finally turned back to address the chamber, her compound eyes reflected what Marcus hoped was careful neutrality. Given the unprecedented nature of these competing proposals, the Council invokes Protocol 7 of the Galactic Covenant. Both motions will be heard in full, with supporting evidence, before any vote is taken. The session will continue until resolution is achieved. Protocol 7 meant they would be here for days, possibly weeks, while every detail of human military history was dissected and debated. But it also meant that the coalition's counter-proposal would receive equal consideration with the Vexillian motion to suspend human membership. Marcus felt a cautious flicker of hope. Ambassador Thexai clearly understood the implications as well. His four eyes glittered with what Marcus recognized as barely controlled fury.
The Vexillian Empire objects to this delay.
The evidence against human militarism is clear and present. Further debate serves only to provide time for political maneuvering that obscures the truth. The truth, Trademaster Kithran replied with surprising heat, is that my people are alive today because humans were willing to act when others would not. If the Vexillian Empire wishes to debate evidence, let us examine who has actually benefited from human military intervention.
What followed was the most complex political debate Marcus had ever witnessed.
Delegate after delegate rose to present evidence, testimony, and arguments both for and against human involvement in galactic affairs. The major powers painted a picture of reckless militarism that threatened stability, while the frontier species countered with detailed accounts of human heroism and sacrifice. But, as the hours passed, Marcus began to notice something unexpected.
The delegates were not simply choosing sides based on political alliance or species loyalty.
Instead, a more nuanced picture was emerging, one that divided the chamber along lines Marcus had not anticipated. It was Delegate Prindara of the Ethereal Commune who first gave voice to the emerging consensus. Her gossamer form floated to the center of the chamber, shimmering with patterns that conveyed deep contemplation. The testimony we have heard today reveals a fundamental truth that transcends the specific question of human territorial claims, she said, her voice carrying the haunting quality that made even the most hardened diplomats pause to listen. We are witnessing the emergence of a new paradigm in galactic civilization, one where moral action takes precedence over institutional procedure. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he realized where this line of reasoning might lead.
Prindara was not simply defending human actions, she was suggesting that those actions represented a new model for how galactic society should operate.
The established powers argue for caution, for procedure, for the careful balance of interests that has maintained stability for centuries, the ethereal continued.
But, what happens when that stability is built upon the suffering of those too weak to demand representation in these chambers? What happens when procedure becomes an excuse for inaction in the face of injustice?
Counselor Yethrun of the Silicon Confederacy resonated with harmonic frequencies that Marcus's translator interpreted as deep displeasure. The ethereal delegate suggests that established institutions have failed in their duties.
Such accusations require extraordinary evidence.
The evidence is before us, Harmony Singer Velthara replied, her crystalline form creating light patterns that seemed to fill the chamber with rainbow fire. 17 separate requests for assistance to the harmonious worlds.
16 polite refusals citing procedural complexity.
One species that chose action over procedure, and 3 billion lives preserved as a result.
The numbers hung in the air like an accusation.
Marcus had known the general details of the harmonious world's crisis, but hearing them presented as stark choices between action and inaction gave them new weight. Chancellor Vorthanan raised one of her arms for attention, her compound eyes reflecting what might have been concern. The debate has moved beyond the specific question of Terran Federation membership to broader questions about the structure of galactic governance itself. Such matters require careful consideration. No, Marcus said, stepping forward into the speaking circle before he fully realized he was moving. These matters require courage. The chamber fell silent as every eye turned toward him. Marcus felt the weight of the moment, understanding that his next words might determine the future of human civilization among the stars.
Honored delegates, you speak of careful consideration as if lives hang in the balance while you debate. They do.
At this very moment, somewhere in the galaxy, there are beings under threat who need help. They are transmitting distress calls to anyone who will listen, hoping that anyone cares enough to respond. Marcus gestured toward the holographic displays that still showed evidence from various conflicts and interventions. You can spend years debating the proper procedures for response to such calls. You can form committees and subcommittees to study the political implications. You can craft elaborate protocols that ensure every stakeholder's interests are considered. But, while you debate, they die.
Ambassador Thexai's four eyes glittered with what looked like triumph.
The human reveals his true nature at last.
He advocates for unilateral action without regard for consequences or consultation.
This is exactly the dangerous mindset we must control. Marcus turned to face the Vexillian directly, feeling the fire in his chest burn brighter.
I advocate for giving a damn about people who are suffering. If that's dangerous, then I'm proud to be dangerous.
The words rang through the chamber with unexpected force. Marcus realized he had abandoned all pretense of diplomatic language, but somehow that felt right.
This moment called for truth, not polished phrases. You want to know what my scars really mean?
Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. They mean I've stood in places where choosing to help meant choosing to hurt.
They mean I've made decisions that couldn't wait for committee approval or bureaucratic review. They mean that when faced with the choice between my own safety and someone else's survival, I chose to take the risk.
Marcus pulled off his formal diplomatic jacket, revealing arms and shoulders covered with the pale lines and raised marks of old wounds. The chamber intake of breath was audible as delegates saw the full extent of the scarring that had been hidden beneath his uniform. This one, he said, pointing to a particularly prominent mark across his left forearm, came from pulling a Fenari child out of a burning transport after raiders hit a civilian convoy. This one, he indicated a series of parallel scars across his shoulder, happened when I used my own body to shield a group of Quillen refugees from shrapnel during an artillery bombardment. He turned slowly, making sure every delegate could see the evidence written on his flesh. Every mark tells the same story, a moment when someone needed help, and I was there to provide it.
You can call that reckless or unilateral or dangerous. I call it being human.
The chamber had grown so quiet that Marcus could hear the soft hum of the life support systems. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but the acoustic enhancement carried every word clearly.
You want to know what happens if you suspend human membership in this council? Nothing changes.
We will still respond when people need help. We will still stand between the innocent and those who would harm them.
The only difference is that you will have chosen to exclude yourselves from the process instead of helping to guide it.
Delegate Prindara floated closer to the speaking circle, her ethereal form shimmering with what Marcus interpreted as profound emotion. The human speaks of choice, but perhaps the choice is not his alone to make. Perhaps each of us must decide what kind of civilization we wish to create. Her words seemed to catalyze something in the chamber. Marcus watched as delegates began to shift in their seats, informal conversations breaking out as species representatives reconsidered their positions. The rigid factional lines that had dominated the early proceedings began to blur as individuals responded to the fundamental moral challenge Prindara had articulated. Trademaster Kithran rose from the coalition seating area, his iridescent fur catching the light as he moved with purposeful steps toward the speaking circle. The Fenari Commercial Guild formally requests permission to share classified trade data with this council.
Chancellor Vorthenen's compound eyes reflected surprise. Classified data requires special protocols. What information does the Trademaster wish to present?
Kithran activated a personal holographic display that filled the chamber with shipping manifests, resource allocation charts, and financial records. For the past 18 months, the Coalition of Frontier Systems has been quietly establishing a humanitarian response fund. Every species that has benefited from human military intervention has contributed resources, equipment, and personnel to support future operations. Marcus felt his breath catch as the implications became clear. The frontier species had not simply been grateful recipients of human aid, they had been actively preparing to institutionalize and support such assistance. The fund currently contains sufficient resources to support a full-scale humanitarian fleet, Kithran continued, his voice carrying growing confidence. Medical ships, supply vessels, rapid response transports, and, yes, military escorts capable of protecting civilian evacuations under hostile conditions. The Trademaster's holographic display shifted to show detailed fleet specifications and deployment plans. We did not create this fund because we believe humans are perfect protectors. We created it because we believe the galaxy needs someone willing to act when action is required, and humans have proven they are willing to pay the price for such action. Ambassador Thexhi's four eyes darted between the display and the other major power delegates, clearly realizing that the political landscape had shifted far more dramatically than anyone had anticipated. The Vexillian Empire questions the legality of such arrangements. Military cooperation between species requires council oversight. Not if it's humanitarian in nature, Harmony Singer Velthara replied, her crystalline form radiating patterns that conveyed absolute certainty. Article 12 of the Galactic Covenant explicitly protects the right of species to cooperate in disaster relief operations. The Coalition has simply chosen to prepare for disasters before they occur rather than scrambling to respond after the fact. Chancellor Vorthenen consulted rapidly with her fellow council members, their whispered conference lasting several minutes before she addressed the chamber again. The information presented raises questions that go far beyond the scope of the original motions. The Council calls for a 2-hour recess to allow all delegations to consult regarding these developments. As the chamber began to empty, Marcus remained in the speaking circle, emotionally drained by the intensity of his testimony. He had laid bare not just his physical scars but the philosophical foundations of human intervention policy. Now all he could do was wait to see whether the galaxy was ready to accept what humanity had to offer. The 2-hour recess stretched into 4 hours as delegations engaged in the most intense political negotiations the Galactic Council had seen in decades. Marcus spent the time in his assigned quarters, trying to process the dramatic shift in the proceedings. What had begun as a defensive mission to protect Kepler-7 had evolved into something much larger, a fundamental reimagining of how galactic civilization might respond to humanitarian crises. When the session finally reconvened, Marcus immediately noticed the changed seating arrangement. The rigid factional blocks had dissolved, replaced by a more fluid grouping that seemed to cut across traditional alliance lines. Most surprising of all, several delegates from the major powers had moved to sit with coalition representatives, suggesting conversations that had produced unexpected results. Chancellor Vorthanen called the session to order with unusual formality, her 6 arms moving in ceremonial gestures that Marcus recognized as those reserved for historic occasions. The gravity in her compound eyes suggested that whatever decision had been reached during the recess would have consequences far beyond the immediate question of human membership. The Council has received multiple formal proposals during the recess period, she announced, her voice carrying across the chamber with crystalline clarity. These proposals represent a fundamental evolution in galactic humanitarian policy. We will hear each motion in order of presentation. Ambassador Thexai rose first, but Marcus immediately sensed that something had changed in the Vexillian's demeanor. The predatory satisfaction that had characterized his earlier presentations was gone, replaced by what looked like grudging resignation. The Vexillian Empire withdraws its motion to suspend Terran Federation membership, Thexai announced, his 4 eyes avoiding direct contact with Marcus. However, we maintain our position that human military activities require enhanced oversight to prevent unintended consequences. The withdrawal came as such a shock that Marcus felt his knees go weak. He had prepared for defeat, had steeled himself for the possibility that humanity might be expelled from the galactic community entirely. To have that threat simply vanish without explanation left him reeling. But, before he could fully process this development, Trademaster Kithran rose from the Coalition seating area with obvious excitement. The Coalition of Frontier Systems formally presents the Humanitarian Response Accords for Council consideration. A new holographic display filled the chamber, this one more comprehensive than any Marcus had seen during the proceedings. It showed organizational charts, command structures, resource allocation protocols, and operational procedures for a galaxy-wide humanitarian response system. The Accords proposed the creation of a galactic humanitarian response force, Kithran explained, his iridescent fur bristling with enthusiasm. This force would operate under Council oversight but, with pre-authorized authority to respond to certified humanitarian crises without waiting for formal debate or political clearance. Marcus stared at the display in amazement. The Coalition had not simply prepared a defense of human intervention, they had created a comprehensive framework for institutionalizing such responses under galactic law. Harmony singer Velthara rose to provide additional detail, her crystalline form radiating patterns of light that seemed to convey profound excitement. The response force would consist of 3 components: rapid assessment teams to evaluate crisis situations, emergency response fleets to provide immediate assistance, and stabilization units to support long-term recovery efforts. The organizational structure was sophisticated beyond anything Marcus had expected from frontier species that were supposedly politically naive. It became clear that the Coalition had been planning this proposal for far longer than the 18 months Kithran had mentioned earlier. Command of the response force would rotate among participating species based on operational requirements and resource contributions, Velthara continued. However, given their demonstrated expertise in crisis intervention, the Terran Federation would serve as primary operational coordinator for military and security operations. The proposal was breathtaking in its scope and implications. Instead of defending human military activities, the Coalition was proposing to make those activities the foundation of a new galactic institution. It was political jujitsu of the highest order, turning humanity's alleged weakness into official strength. Chancellor Vorthanen's compound eyes reflected what might have been admiration as she studied the holographic displays. The proposal represents a significant evolution in galactic governance philosophy. However, such fundamental changes require extensive consideration and debate. With respect, Chancellor, Delegate Prindara interrupted, floating toward the center of the chamber with her gossamer form shimmering with urgency. Extensive consideration is exactly what has prevented effective response to humanitarian crises in the past. The coalition proposes immediate implementation on a trial basis, with formal review after 2 standard years of operations. The ethereal delegate's intervention was unprecedented. Her species rarely involved themselves in practical political matters, preferring to remain above the mundane concerns of governance and administration. Her support for immediate action carried weight that transcended normal political calculations. Councillor Yethron of the Silicon Confederacy resonated with harmonic frequencies that conveyed deep skepticism. The proposal amounts to creating an independent military force with minimal oversight. Such arrangements have historically led to the very abuses we seek to prevent. Marcus realized this was the moment he had been building toward throughout the entire proceedings. The Silicon Confederacy had identified the real issue, not whether humanitarian intervention was necessary, but whether it could be institutionalized without creating new forms of oppression. Council Keeper Yethron raises a valid concern, Marcus said, stepping forward into the speaking circle. The history of galactic civilization includes numerous examples of military forces that began with humanitarian mandates but evolved into instruments of conquest. The admission seemed to surprise several delegates, who had clearly expected him to defend the proposal unconditionally. But Marcus had learned the importance of acknowledging legitimate concerns while making his case. However, he continued, the coalition proposal includes safeguards specifically designed to prevent such abuse. Response force operations would be limited to certified humanitarian crises, defined by objective criteria and verified by independent assessment teams. No territorial claims could be established through humanitarian intervention, and all operations would be subject to immediate council review upon request by any member species. Marcus activated his own holographic display, showing detailed protocols that had apparently been developed in coordination with the coalition during the recess. Most importantly, the response force would have no independent funding or resource base. All operations would depend on continued support from member species, creating a natural check against mission creep or unauthorized expansion. The safeguards were comprehensive, addressing every historical example of humanitarian organizations that had transformed into imperial instruments. Marcus realized that someone, probably multiple someones, had spent considerable time studying the failures of past attempts at institutionalized intervention. Ambassador Thexhi's 4 eyes glittered with what looked like renewed interest. The safeguards are impressive in theory, but who would enforce them? What prevents the response force from simply ignoring council oversight once it gains operational independence? The question struck at the heart of the political challenge. Any organization powerful enough to effectively intervene in humanitarian crises would also be powerful enough to resist oversight if it chose to do so. It was the classic problem of who watches the watchers. But, before Marcus could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the chamber's tension. Keeper Myralshan of the Quillen Archive rose from the lower tiers, her small form somehow commanding attention despite her species' usual preference for remaining in the background. The Quillen Archive offers a solution to the enforcement problem, Myralshan announced, her voice carrying the authority of millennia of accumulated knowledge. We propose to serve as permanent observers and historical recorders for all response force operations. The offer was stunning in its implications. The Quillen Archive was legendary for its absolute neutrality and comprehensive record-keeping. Their archives contained the definitive historical record of galactic civilization, and their testimony was accepted as fact by every major power. Quillen observers would be present during all response force operations, Myralshan continued. Their reports would be transmitted directly to Council archives, creating a permanent record that could not be altered or suppressed. Any deviation from authorized humanitarian mandates would be immediately documented and reported. Marcus felt a surge of hope as he realized the political genius of the offer. The Quillen had effectively solved the oversight problem by volunteering to serve as incorruptible witnesses. Their reputation for neutrality meant that their reports would be trusted by all parties, while their small size and non-military nature meant they posed no threat to response force operations. Chancellor Vorthanen consulted with her fellow council members in rapid conference, their whispered discussion lasting several minutes before she addressed the chamber again. The Quillen offer addresses significant concerns regarding oversight and accountability. However, the fundamental question remains whether this council is prepared to authorize the creation of an independent humanitarian response capability. Not independent, Trademaster Kithran corrected with surprising firmness. Interdependent.
The response force would require continued cooperation from dozens of species to maintain operational capability. This creates natural checks against abuse while enabling rapid response to genuine crises. The distinction was important, Marcus realized. Instead of creating a single powerful organization that might eventually challenge council authority, the proposal would create a network of cooperative relationships that strengthened overall galactic unity while addressing humanitarian needs. The debate continued for another hour, with delegates raising technical questions about operational procedures, resource allocation, and command structures. But Marcus could sense that the political momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the proposal. The combination of coalition preparation, Quillen oversight, and careful safeguards had addressed most legitimate concerns while offering clear benefits to all participating species. When Chancellor Vorthanen finally called for formal votes on the competing proposals, the results exceeded Marcus's most optimistic expectations. The motion to suspend Terran Federation membership was defeated by a margin of nearly 3-1, with several major powers joining the coalition in opposition. But the real surprise came with the vote on the Humanitarian Response Accords. The proposal passed with overwhelming support, endorsed by every frontier species and a surprising number of major power delegates. Even the Silicon Confederacy voted in favor after securing additional language regarding operational oversight and periodic review procedures. As the final vote tallies were announced, Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. Relief at humanity's vindication, pride in the coalition's sophisticated political maneuvering, and something approaching awe at the scope of what had been accomplished. But, perhaps most significantly, he felt a deep sense of validation for every scar on his body, every wound earned in service to others, every moment when he had chosen to act rather than hesitate. The galaxy had not simply accepted humanity's approach to humanitarian intervention, it had embraced that approach as a model for galactic civilization itself. Chancellor Vorthanen rose to deliver the formal conclusion of the proceedings, her 6 arms moving in ceremonial gestures that marked the end of historic deliberations. The Council hereby recognizes the Humanitarian Response Accords as binding galactic law, effective immediately. The Terran Federation is formally designated as primary operational coordinator for emergency response operations, subject to the oversight and safeguards detailed in the Accords. She paused, her compound eyes reflecting what Marcus hoped was respect. Furthermore, the Council extends formal recognition of all existing Terran territorial claims, including the Kepler-7 colony, in appreciation of humanity's service to galactic humanitarian needs. The chamber erupted in discussion as delegates realized the full implications of what had just occurred. Humanity had not simply been vindicated, it had been elevated to a unique position within galactic civilization, with official authority to do what it had been doing unofficially for years. As the session formally adjourned and delegates began filing out of the chamber, Marcus remained in the speaking circle, still processing the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The scars that had been mocked as signs of weakness had become symbols of a new approach to galactic civilization, one that valued courage over caution, action over procedure, and the willingness to sacrifice for others over political calculation. Keeper Myril Shan approached him as the chamber emptied, her small form moving with characteristic grace. "Representative Chen," she said, her voice carrying warmth that had been absent during the formal proceedings, "the Quillen Archive would be honored to record your personal account of these proceedings for historical preservation." Marcus looked down at the small being who had played such a crucial role in the day's events, then, at his own scarred hands, and, finally, at the empty chamber where the course of galactic history had just been changed forever. "I would be honored, Keeper," he replied, understanding that his story, and humanity's story, was now permanently woven into the fabric of galactic civilization. "Though I think the real story isn't about my scars, but about what happens when the galaxy chooses to embrace the values those scars represent." As they walked together toward the chamber exits, Marcus reflected on how completely the proceedings had exceeded his expectations. He had come to defend Kepler-7 and had ended up helping to create a new model for galactic governance. The beings who had mocked his wounds had ultimately embraced the warrior spirit those wounds represented, recognizing that sometimes civilization requires citizens willing to bear scars in service of higher ideals. The future that stretched ahead would bring new challenges, new crises that would test the Humanitarian Response Accords and humanity's ability to live up to the trust placed in them. But, for the first time since arriving at the council chambers, Marcus felt confident that both humanity and the galaxy as a whole were ready to face those challenges together, united by a shared commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves.
The warrior they had underestimated had indeed changed the course of history, not through conquest or domination, but by demonstrating that true strength lies in the willingness to sacrifice for others, and that the deepest scars often mark the greatest souls.